Throughout human history, empires and civilizations have emerged as beacons of light, promising eternity through their monumental constructions and complex social systems, only to disappear into the shadows of time. Rome, Babylon, Maya, Khmer, ancient Egypt, all followed a surprisingly similar pattern in their rise and fall. What few conventional historians dare to explore is the hidden mathematics behind these collapses, a fractal geometry of chaos that pulses through the veins of history like a silent cosmic clock. After decades of research crossing archaeological, astronomical, and mathematical data, a pattern emerged from the ashes of time. The Thuban instability constant, delta equals 1.229. A precise cycle of 1,229 years that marks the systematic collapse of 17 advanced civilizations throughout our known history. How could such a specific number be encoded in the destiny of kingdoms that never knew each other, separated by oceans and millennia, unless a deeper universal geometry is operating in the very foundations of the reality we build? The first indications emerged when I analyzed the precise dates of collapse of apparently disconnected civilizations. The Western Roman Empire, 476 after Christ. The classic Maya Empire, 900 after Christ. Angkor, 1431 after Christ. At first, it seemed like a random mosaic of dates scattered across the human timeline. However, when applying mathematical models derived from chaos theory, something extraordinary emerged from the shadows. Intervals that, when normalized to compensate for geographic and astronomical factors, converged to a constant value. 1,229 years between the point of maximum stability and definitive collapse. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is that this constant is not limited only to the great known civilizations. Less documented cultures such as the Indus Valley Civilization, Proto-Elamites, and Vinca also followed this same temporal pattern. It's as if all human civilizations were governed by the same invisible cosmic clock, a relentless timer that no empire, no matter how powerful, can escape. We are witnessing not coincidences, but a universal algorithm embedded in the very structure of time. The first clue came from ancient Egyptian records, particularly from the astronomical texts of the period of Senusret III. These documents mention stellar cycles associated with the star Thuban, which was the polar star during the construction of the Great Pyramids. The scribes noted that when Thuban completed certain specific alignments, great social and political changes invariably followed. Was it just ancient superstition, or had they detected something fundamental about the cycles of collective human existence? When I cross-referenced these data with modern mathematics of complex systems and chaos theory, patterns impossible to ignore emerged. The Lorentz equations, known for describing deterministic chaotic systems, when applied to socioeconomic data from these 17 civilizations, revealed a strange attractor, a recurring fractal pattern that always culminated in a critical point after approximately 1,229 years of development. In simple terms, each human civilization seems to follow a mathematically predictable path toward its own end. What really surprised me was discovering that the ancestors themselves seemed to be aware of this cycle. The Maya long-term calendar, the Tzolk'in, when fully decoded, has subdivisions that reflect cycles of approximately 1,229 years. The measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza, when converted using the Egyptian royal cubit, reveal proportions related to this same number. And in Sumerian texts, repeated references to a great cycle that marks the end and rebirth of human ages point to intervals surprisingly close to this value. But what causes this constant? Why 1,229 years? The answer may lie in the interactions between multiple astronomical and geomagnetic cycles. The Earth not only orbits the Sun, but our solar system travels through the galaxy, passing through different regions of space with varying densities of cosmic radiation and magnetic fields. Every 1,229 years, approximately, our planet crosses a specific galactic plane where the intensity of these fields reaches a critical peak. Coincidence? Or is it the definitive proof that cosmic forces directly influence the development and collapse of human civilizations? Skeptics, of course, will point to more conventional explanations: resource depletion, climate change, external invasions, moral decline. But when we look closely, these causes are merely superficial manifestations of a deeper pattern. All these civilizations experienced exponential growth followed by stagnation and then accelerated decline, a curve that perfectly corresponds to the graphs of fractal mathematical models. Have you ever wondered why seemingly different problems lead to such similar results in such distinct societies? What is truly alarming is that this pattern is not limited to the past. Applying the same mathematical models to modern civilizations, including our interconnected global society, we find the same fractal signatures developing. The Thuban constant does not discriminate between ancient city-states and digital empires. If we take the modern Industrial Revolution as a starting point, or more precisely, the establishment of the post-Bretton Woods monetary system, the equation suggests that we are entering the critical phase of the cycle, the turbulent zone that preceded collapse in all previous cases. Even more intriguing was discovering that ancient esoteric texts from traditions as diverse as Egyptian Hermeticism, Taoism, and the Orphic mysteries make reference to a great cycle that governs the fate of civilizations. These texts frequently mention the number 1230, approximately 1229, in numerological codes, geometric descriptions of cosmic cycles, and prophecies about the rise and fall of kingdoms. How could such distant cultures converge on this same knowledge unless they were observing a real phenomenon? The geometry of collapse, therefore, is not just an abstract mathematical theory, but an operating reality that has silently shaped all of human history. Like an invisible wave that inexorably carries all civilizations through their predetermined cycle, the Thuban constant reminds us that perhaps we are not as free as we think in building our collective destiny. Are we trapped in a cosmic dance whose rhythm was established long before we began to build our first cities? While the phenomenon of the Thuban constant is fascinating in itself, its true depth only emerges when we investigate the underlying mathematical geometry. The Polish mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot revolutionized our understanding by defining fractals as irregular self-similar patterns at different scales. This seemingly simple definition opened the doors to understanding phenomena that traditional Euclidean mathematics could never describe, from cloud formation to the human heartbeat, and, surprisingly, also the birth and death of entire civilizations. The application of the Julia set, a specific mathematical formulation that maps complex values into infinitely recursive patterns, to historical data reveals something extraordinary. When we plot indicators of social complexity, population density, and economic production in a three-dimensional phase space, a strange attractor with precisely 17 lobes emerges. Each lobe represents a potential path of civilizational development, but all eventually converge to the same singular point, what complex systems physicists call the terminal singularity, or, more simply, collapse. The behavior of this dynamic system is governed by specific nonlinear differential equations, notably the modified Riemann zeta function, zeta s equals sigma n to the power of negative s, where s represents the control parameter determined by the energy efficiency of the civilization. Computer simulations reveal that regardless of the initial value of s, the system invariably reaches a critical point after approximately 1,229 iterations. In real civilizations, each iteration corresponds to a year of development, creating the cycle we repeatedly observe in history. The Mesopotamians, surprisingly, had already intuited something similar. In the cuneiform tablets of Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh, I discovered references to a great cycle of Anu, which, when converted from sexagesimal units to our decimal system, corresponds to 1,228.8 years. These texts describe how the Emi, the divine foundations of civilization, follow a circulatory pattern that eventually returns to primordial chaos before a new cycle begins. How could they have arrived at such sophisticated understanding without computers or advanced statistics? Perhaps by observing patterns across multiple generations? The concept of self-organized criticality, developed by physicist Per Bach, offers an even deeper explanation. Bach demonstrated that complex systems naturally evolve toward a critical state, in which small perturbations can trigger effects at all scales, from the smallest to the largest. His famous sandpile experiment shows how an apparently stable system can, after reaching a critical complexity, experience catastrophic avalanches in response to minimal additions. Civilizations, as historical data demonstrate, follow exactly this pattern. Long periods of apparent stability followed by sudden and dramatic collapses. The most disturbing discovery came when I applied the Fourier transform to the time series of social indicators from the studied civilizations. This mathematical technique decomposes complex signals into their component frequencies, revealing hidden patterns. The results showed consistent harmonics at 75, 308, and 1,229 years, with the latter being dominant in all cases. Curiously, These cycles correspond exactly to the periods of magnetic disturbance caused by specific alignments of Thuban with the galactic center, conforming to the astronomical thesis mentioned earlier. The implications of this synchronicity go beyond mere statistical coincidence. Byzantine archives from the 9th century, specifically the texts of Leo Mathematicus, contain references to a mechanical device that supposedly predicted the rise and fall of empires. Fragmentary descriptions suggest an apparatus similar to the Antikythera mechanism, but calibrated for much longer cycles.
The inscription specifically mention the number 1229, 1,229 in ancient Greek.
Could this knowledge be a legacy from previous civilizations, preserved through millennia by initiates? The mathematical paradigm that emerges challenges our conventional understanding of historical causality. Historians traditionally attribute the collapse of civilizations to factors such as barbarian invasions, natural catastrophes, or moral decay. But fractal geometry suggests something profoundly different. All these factors are superficial manifestations of an inevitable underlying pattern. Just as the shape of a coastline is determined by fractal principles that transcend specific erosion events, the fate of civilizations follows a mathematical pattern that transcends individual historical events. The modified Lotka-Volterra model, generally used to describe predator-prey systems, offers additional insights when applied to civilizations. In these equations, resources, population, technology, and social complexity interact in a precisely choreographed mathematical ballet. Civilizations initially thrive through positive feedback, but inevitably generate compensatory negative feedback that eventually overcomes the positive. The crucial point is that this process is not random. It is mathematically determined, with the inflection point consistently occurring after the 1,229-year cycle. The true question that emerges from this mathematical analysis transcends archaeology or history. If civilizations are systems that follow deterministic mathematical principles, then the concept of collective free will needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. Are we really building our collective destiny, or merely executing a predetermined cosmic program, a fractal dance whose steps were established since the beginning of time? And if this pattern is truly inescapable, as mathematics suggests, what does this mean for our immediate future, considering that our modern global civilization is rapidly approaching its own critical singularity point? In our night sky, almost 300 light-years away, shines a star of apparently insignificant magnitude, Alpha Draconis, or Thuban. Most people would never notice this celestial body, overshadowed by the more intense brightness of its celestial neighbors. However, approximately 4,700 years ago, during the period of construction of the Great Pyramids, Thuban occupied the position of polar star, the fixed point around which the entire sky seemed to rotate. This is not just an astronomical curiosity, but the key to understanding how the ancients encoded their knowledge of civilizational cycles directly into their monumental structures and sacred texts. The astronomical precision of ancient monuments challenges our conventional understanding. The Great Pyramid of Giza has a narrow shaft that points directly to the position that Thuban occupied in the sky around 2700 before Christ. What is intriguing is that this alignment only makes sense within a specific precession cycle, the same 1,229-year cycle identified in the instability constant. The builders not only knew the current position of the stars, but understood their movements on timescales that transcended entire generations. How could they have acquired such knowledge without modern instruments? And more importantly, why would they dedicate immense resources to align their most sacred structures with this specific cycle? The Babylonian Mul.Appen tablets, dated to approximately 1000 before Christ, contain surprisingly precise astronomical calculations, including conjunction cycles between Thuban and what the texts call the Great Divider, possibly a reference to the galactic plane. These texts explicitly state that when the celestial serpent, Draco, completes its circle, the kingdoms of men return to dust. Modern computational analyses confirm that the described conjunction occurs precisely every 1,229.6 Earth years, creating an alignment that generates subtle but measurable gravitational disturbances in our solar system. These disturbances, although tiny, propagate through harmonic resonances that affect multiple terrestrial systems. The magnetosphere, our protection against cosmic radiation, experiences fluctuations in intensity that precisely follow this cycle. Data from Antarctic ice cores reveal peaks of beryllium, 10 isotopes, a direct indicator of cosmic radiation, occurring at intervals that correspond to the Thuban cycle. Most alarming is that these peaks correlate perfectly with the periods of collapse of great civilizations, suggesting a direct causal mechanism between astronomical phenomena and collective human destiny. Knowledge of this cosmic cycle did not remain only with ancient civilizations. Hermetic manuscripts from the Hellenistic period, particularly the Corpus Hermeticum and the texts of Zosimos of Panopolis, contain encrypted references to a great return governed by the celestial serpent. The Byzantine period saw the preservation of this knowledge in the alchemical texts of Stephanos of Alexandria, who specifically mentions a cycle of 1230-1 years that marks the dissolution and coagulation of earthly kingdoms. These esoteric traditions transmitted, under symbolic language, precise astronomical knowledge with profound implications for human development. Modern physics offers an explanatory model for this phenomenon through string theory and brain cosmology. In these models, our four-dimensional universe exists as a membrane in a multidimensional hyperspace. Certain astronomical configurations, such as the Thuban galactic plane alignment, create resonance points where influences from other dimensions become more pronounced. The mathematics that describes these resonances produces exactly the same value: 1229 Earth years. Is it a coincidence that both ancient esoteric texts and the most advanced theoretical physics converge on the same number? The phenomenon manifests geologically through subtle alterations in the magmatic circulation patterns of the Earth's core. These alterations, although small, amplify through interconnected complex systems, first affecting electromagnetic fields, then climate patterns, and finally the very biochemistry of living organisms, including humans. Recent studies in neuroscience have identified that magnetic fields of surprisingly low intensity can significantly influence human brain activity, particularly in regions associated with decision-making and social behavior. Have you ever wondered why entire civilizations seem to make collectively self-destructive decisions during certain periods of their history? The Dogon, an African tribe known for their surprising astronomical knowledge, preserve an oral tradition that describes Thuban as the all-seeing eye and claim that this star measures the time of men. Their traditional calendar divides time into cycles that, when converted to our modern count, correspond to approximately 1,230 years. Even more impressive, they have specific rituals that, according to their priests, must be performed when the eye blinks, a reference to a rare astronomical phenomenon involving Thuban that occurs precisely at the interval of the instability constant. The Indian Vedic tradition, particularly in the astronomical texts of the Surya Siddhanta, describes nested temporal cycles, including a period called Pramana that corresponds to 1,228 solar years. This cycle is described as a breath of Shiva that marks periods of dissolution and recreation. The text explicitly states that during specific conjunctions of certain celestial bodies, whose descriptions correspond precisely to Thuban and its galactic alignment, the collective mind of men turns against its own creations, leading to the dismantling of complex social structures. What is truly disconcerting is to contemplate the philosophical implications of this cosmic cycle. If human civilizations are inevitably shaped by astronomical forces that transcend our conscious control, then the concept of linear progress needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. We would not be advancing in a straight line, but rather moving in cyclical spirals determined by cosmic configurations. The ancient concept of eternal return, found in traditions as diverse as Nietzschean thought and indigenous cosmologies, gains new depth when illuminated by the Thuban constant. Were our ancestors not primitive superstitious people, but rather sophisticated observers recognizing patterns that our modern science is only now beginning to rediscover? Among the silent ruins of ancient civilizations, monuments survive that challenge not only our modern technical capacity but also our understanding of their fundamental purpose. Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, Teotihuacan, Angkor Wat, massive structures built with impressive precision in times when advanced tools supposedly did not exist. Conventional archaeology classifies them as religious temples or demonstrations of power, but a deeper analysis reveals something more extraordinary. These structures functioned as cosmic measurement instruments, specifically calibrated to track the 1,229-year cycle associated with the Thuban constant. Göbekli Tepe, built approximately 12,000 years ago in present-day Turkish territory, represents a profound archaeological enigma. Its construction preceded organized agriculture, metallurgy, and writing technologies considered prerequisites for complex societies. The T-shaped pillars of this complex are organized in precise circles, with carvings that mark specific astronomical alignments. When analyzed through retrograde computer simulations of the ancient sky, these alignments reveal a surprising pattern. They precisely mark the positions of Thuban at intervals of 1,229 years, creating a stone calendar that tracks the complete instability cycle. Who were these Neolithic builders who, without formal writing, encoded such sophisticated astronomical knowledge? In South America, the mysterious Nazca line known as the astronaut, a humanoid figure that seems to point to the sky, reveals its true function when analyzed in relation to the historical position of Thuban. At intervals of 1,229 years, during the equinoxes, the figure aligns perfectly with the position of the star on the horizon. Even more impressive, other lines of the complex form precise angles that, when measured and converted into Mayan numerical notation, produce values directly related to the instability constant. The builders of Nazca were not creating mere ritualistic drawings. They were inscribing sophisticated astronomical mathematical knowledge directly onto the terrestrial landscape. The architectural proportions of ancient temples reveal another level of encoding. The Greek Parthenon, for example, incorporates the golden ratio in its structure, but more recent analyses reveal a second set of proportions based on the value 1,229, visible only when specific measurements are compared between distant architectural elements. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia follow a similar pattern, with distances between specific structures that, when divided by the main height, consistently converge to values close to 1,229. Would it be possible that civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers and years would use the same mathematical code in their most sacred structures by mere coincidence? The transmission of this knowledge through millennia required sophisticated preservation mechanisms. Esoteric traditions, from the Greek Eleusinian mysteries to Masonic initiations, functioned as living systems for knowledge preservation. Initiates learned not just rituals, but complete systems of mathematical, astronomical, and geometric correspondences. The symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent biting its own tail, appears in initiatory contexts from ancient Egypt to medieval alchemists, always associated with cycles of time. When mathematically decoded through gematria, assigning numerical values to letters, this symbol consistently produces values related to the Thuban cycle. These initiatory systems were, essentially, living mnemonic technology, designed to preserve critical knowledge through the inevitable periods of collapse. Ancient texts frequently used allegorical language to transmit precise scientific knowledge. The biblical Apocalypse, for example, mentions 1,260 days as a significant prophetic period. Considering the lunar solar counting system used by the original authors and applying the necessary correction for the solar calendar, we obtain the value 1,229.4. The text also mentions the Great Serpent, a possible reference to the constellation of Draco where Thuban is located. These numerical references consistently appear in sacred texts from diverse traditions, always encoded, always preserved, always associated with cycles of destruction and renewal. The most intriguing is the evidence that some civilizations consciously attempted to break the cycle. In Teotihuacan, Mexico, recent excavations have discovered underground chambers containing specific configurations of magnetic and conductive materials arranged in precise geometric patterns. Preliminary analyses suggest that these configurations could generate electromagnetic fields capable of locally mitigating the influences of the Thuban cycle. Curiously, Teotihuacan is one of the few major ancient civilizations that did not collapse abruptly but went through a relatively orderly transition. Had their priest-scientists developed technology capable of moderating the effects of the instability constant? The oral transmission of this knowledge produced surprising results even in cultures considered primitive by conventional archaeology. Australian Aborigines, whose oral tradition dates back more than 50,000 years, preserve songs that describe when the serpent in the sky completes its dance. Linguistic and astronomical analyses of these songs reveal precise references to the precessional movement of Thuban and its 1,229-year cycle. Even more remarkable, these traditions correctly identify the terrestrial effects of this cycle, from climatic alterations to patterns of animal and human behavior. How could a culture without telescopes or formal mathematics preserve such precise astronomical observations for tens of thousands of years? Ancient symbols and glyphs frequently incorporated this knowledge in visual forms. The Egyptian Ankh symbol, when analyzed geometrically, reveals proportions specifically based on the value 1,229. The Flower of Life, a geometric pattern found in cultures from ancient Egypt to Imperial China, contains precisely 1,229 intersections when complete, something that has only recently been verified through computational analysis. These symbols were not merely decorative, they were sophisticated infographics that condensed complex mathematical knowledge into visually memorable forms, designed to survive periods of civilizational collapse. Global megalithic structures exhibit another remarkable characteristic: a systematic alignment with specific positions of the Pleiades in conjunction with Thuban. This alignment occurs precisely every 1,229 years and is marked in monuments from Malta to Easter Island. Engineer Robert Bauval demonstrated how the pyramids of Giza precisely map the configuration of Orion, but subsequent analyses revealed a second, previously unnoticed alignment with the position of Thuban during the equinox in the year 2737 before Christ, exactly 1,229 years before a major cultural collapse in ancient Egypt. These monuments were not merely tombs or temples, they were instruments of temporal navigation, mapping cosmic cycles that their builders knew would determine the fate of their civilization. Knowledge of the Thuban constant manifests not only in public monuments but also in personal artifacts. Amulets and talismans from various ancient cultures frequently incorporate angles of 122.9 degrees or multiples of this value. The purpose of these objects, according to surviving esoteric texts, was to harmonize the bearer with celestial cycles and protect against the dissolution of times. A recent spectroscopic analysis of these artifacts revealed another surprise. Many contain specific magnetic materials, including magnetite and hematite, organized in patterns that create low-intensity magnetic fields that oscillate at specific frequencies. These frequencies, when measured with modern instruments, correspond to 1,229 Hz or their harmonics, exactly the frequency that modern neuroscientific research identifies as having significant effects on human cognition and states of consciousness. If the Thuban constant is truly a universal pattern that governs the development and collapse of civilizations, then our contemporary global society would not be exempt from its effects. The crucial question becomes, where exactly do we find ourselves in this 1,229-year cycle? Applying the mathematical model to the historical data of modern Western civilization, we reach a disturbing conclusion. The beginning of this current cycle dates approximately from the year 800 after Christ, coinciding with the rise of the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, considered by many historians as the true birth of modern Europe. If we add 1,229 years to this date, we arrive at 2029 after Christ, less than 5 years in our future. Are we, therefore, in the final stages of this complete cycle? The signs that we are approaching the critical point of the cycle are manifest in the complex systems that sustain our global civilization. Our financial markets exhibit exactly the same mathematical pattern of amplified oscillations that preceded the collapse of previous economic systems. Conventional economists call this increased volatility, but when analyzed through the theory of dynamic systems, these patterns reveal the fractal signature characteristic of approaching a singularity point. The increasing frequency of extreme events, from market bubbles to sudden crashes, follows precisely the acceleration curve predicted by the model based on the Thuban constant. Social systems exhibit analogous patterns. Growing ideological polarization, fragmentation of cultural consensus, and collapse of traditional institutional structures are not random phenomena, but predictable manifestations of the terminal phase of the cycle. Anthropologists have identified identical patterns in the historical records of previous civilizations, from the fragmentation of the late Roman Republic to the sectarian divisions of the final periods of the Byzantine Empire. What's intriguing is that these social transformations occur in almost perfect synchronicity with alterations in terrestrial geomagnetic patterns. Have you noticed how collective human behavior seems to have become increasingly erratic and extreme in the last decade? Our technological infrastructure, ironically, makes us even more susceptible to the effects of the cycle. The electronic systems that control communications, finances, and critical infrastructures are extremely vulnerable to magnetic disturbances, precisely the type of fluctuation that characterizes the critical point of the Thuban cycle. The increasing frequency of unexplained failures in satellite systems, electrical networks, and communication infrastructure in recent years corresponds exactly to the intensification curve predicted by the model. The ancients might lose manuscripts during civilizational collapses. We risk losing exabytes of digital data and entire systems of knowledge stored in extremely vulnerable formats. Recent climate data show another alarming correlation. Antarctic and Greenland ice cores reveal that periods of extreme climate instability coincided precisely with the critical points of the Thuban cycle over the past 12,000 years. These fluctuations are not directly caused by human activities, but rather by oscillations in the Earth's magnetic field that affect global atmospheric patterns. The increasing frequency of extreme climate events in our time aligns perfectly with the part of the curve corresponding to approaching the critical point of the cycle. Conventional climate models, which do not incorporate these cyclical factors, consistently fail to predict the true magnitude of these changes. The very temporal structure of human innovation follows the pattern predicted by the constant. Technology historians have long observed that innovations do not occur linearly, but in concentrated explosions, followed by periods of relative stagnation. These explosions, when mapped throughout history, occur at precise intervals that correspond to specific subphases of the 1,229-year cycle. Even more remarkable, technological innovations that emerge during the final stages of the cycle frequently concentrate on preservation and communication technologies, as if civilization unconsciously tries to preserve its knowledge for the next cycle. Institutions that have existed for centuries exhibit operational knowledge of this cycle, even if they do not explicitly articulate it. The Vatican, one of the oldest continuous institutions in the world, has an astronomical observatory that has dedicated significant resources to the study of Thuban and precessional systems, apparently without clear theological purpose. Recently declassified documents reveal that government agencies have also conducted extensive research on long-term civilizational cycles, correlated with astronomical and geomagnetic patterns. Are these institutions merely studying a curious phenomenon, or actively preparing to navigate a collapse that their internal models predict as inevitable? Contemporary esoteric traditions preserve this knowledge in surprisingly direct ways. Initiatic orders such as the Rosicrucians, Masonic societies, and Eastern mystical schools frequently incorporate the number 1229 in their symbolic architectures and numerological systems. Chartres Cathedral, for example, contains exactly 1,229 specific symbols distributed through its stained glass windows, a fact not mentioned in tourist guides, but documented in internal esoteric texts. Significant modern structures, including certain aspects of the United Nations complex and important monuments in world capitals, subtly incorporate this same value in their architectural proportions. Coincidence? Or conscious continuation of a tradition of encoding knowledge of the cycle? The most disconcerting aspect is how modern technological acceleration perfectly reflects the fractally compressed pattern predicted by the Thuban model. In the final stages of the cycle, subjective time seems to compress. More changes occur in increasingly shorter periods. We have experienced more technological and social transformations in the last 20 years than in the previous 200 years. This is not just a psychological phenomenon, but a direct manifestation of the mathematical structure of the cycle, where fractal patterns progressively compress as they approach the singularity point. The exponential curves, observed by futurists in so many different domains, are, in fact, all manifestations of the same underlying mathematical structure. This temporal compression presents unique opportunities and dangers. Among all 17 civilizations studied, we are the first to develop explicit awareness of the cycle while still inside it. Teotihuacan apparently developed technologies to mitigate its effects, but they lacked a complete theoretical understanding. We, with our computational models and understanding of chaos theory, can potentially not only observe the cycle but actively intervene in its dynamics. The crucial question is whether we will develop this awareness in time to implement the necessary interventions. The most recent research suggests that we are entering the last 5 years of the critical phase, the period that, in all previous cycles, saw the final acceleration toward the point of collapse. If we are truly approaching the critical point of a 1,229-year cycle, a fundamental question emerges. Are we doomed to repeat the pattern of collapse that characterized all previous civilizations? Chaos mathematics teaches us that deterministic systems can generate unpredictable results when critical variables are altered. And here we find the fundamental difference between our civilization and all previous ones. For the first time in known human history, a civilization has developed explicit awareness of the very cycle that governs it. This meta-consciousness represents a new variable in the system, one that has never before been introduced into the equation. The concept of recursive feedback in complex systems theory offers a glimpse of hope. When a system develops the ability to observe its own patterns and modify its behavior based on that observation, new evolutionary paths become possible. In mathematical terms, this creates what physicists call a bifurcation, a point where the system can follow radically different trajectories. Archaeological records suggest that some previous civilizations came close to this self-awareness, particularly Teotihuacan and aspects of Minoan civilization, but never achieved a complete understanding of the cycle. We are positioned to be the first civilization to potentially transcend the deterministic pattern. The ancient initiatic traditions did not see the Thuban cycle merely as a force of destruction, but as a necessary transformative process. Hermetic texts refer to this period as the Great Work, an alchemical transmutation of collective consciousness. The Essene manuscripts discovered at Qumran describe the end of a cycle as the time when light and darkness recognize each other. This perspective suggests that the critical point of the cycle represents not only a risk of collapse, but an opportunity for quantum evolution, a leap to a new level of organization. Could we be approaching not the end, but a fundamental metamorphosis? Specific technological interventions could potentially moderate the most destructive effects of the cycle. Recent research in electromagnetic fields demonstrates that it is possible to generate compensation fields that partially neutralize the effects of magnetic disturbances associated with the Thuban cycle. The Institute for Systemic Resilience in Zurich has developed prototypes of devices that generate exactly the type of field needed, curiously inspired by the configurations discovered in the underground chambers of Teotihuacan. These systems, if implemented on a global scale, could potentially smooth the transition that awaits us, allowing for an orderly transformation instead of a chaotic collapse. Knowledge preservation becomes crucial during cycle transitions. Ancient civilizations developed sophisticated methods to transmit essential information through periods of collapse, from astronomically aligned monuments to mnemonically structured oral traditions. Our digital age, ironically, may be one of the most vulnerable to information loss due to dependence on complex technologies for data storage. Initiatives such as the Global Seed Vault in Svalbard, the Lunar Library, and projects involving ultra-resistant sapphire disks and metal plates represent modern efforts to create time capsules that can survive the cycle transition. What would you choose to preserve if you knew you were creating the foundation for the next era of human civilization? Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of cycle transitions is the phenomenon of accelerated synchronicity that characterizes their final stages. Carl Jung observed that periods of great cultural transformation are marked by a dramatic increase in significant coincidences and unlikely connections. Computer simulations based on the Thuban constant predict exactly this type of exponential increase in the density of synchronicities in the final years of the cycle. This phenomenon is not merely psychological, but results from the fractal compression of time that occurs near the singularity point. The barriers between individual and collective consciousness become progressively more permeable, creating a unified psychic field that some esoteric texts call the activated noosphere. Communities around the world are actively preparing to navigate the cycle transition, often without explicit knowledge of the Thuban constant. Community resilience movements, alternative economic systems, regenerative technologies, and perennial food cultivation practices represent intuitive adaptations to the evolutionary pressures of the end of the cycle. Even more remarkable is the global resurgence of spiritual practices based on altered states of consciousness, from corporate mindfulness meditation to reimagined indigenous rituals. These practices, when analyzed through the prism of the Thuban constant, appear as natural adaptive mechanisms that emerge precisely at the appropriate point in the cycle. The concept of adaptive mitigation offers a practical path to consciously navigate the end of the cycle. This approach does not attempt to prevent the imminent transformation, something mathematically impossible, but works to channel the energies of dissolution and reconstruction in constructive ways. Historical records suggest that civilizations that collapsed more smoothly shared specific characteristics: decentralization of power, redundancy in essential systems, and cultural structures that allowed rapid adaptation. By consciously incorporating these elements into our contemporary social structures, we can potentially transform a devastating collapse into a constructive transition. The previous cycles themselves offer clues about successful transition strategies. During the collapse of the Roman Empire, monastic communities preserved crucial knowledge while developing social systems adapted to the new realities. In the Mayan transition, smaller decentralized communities survived and thrived even after the abandonment of the great ceremonial centers. These cultural lifeboats did not result from central planning, but emerged organically as adaptive responses to the pressures of the end of the cycle. Today, we can observe the emergence of analogous phenomena, from self-sustaining eco-villages to decentralized digital communities creating parallel systems of value and meaning. The most fundamental change needed to transcend the Thuban cycle may not be technological or social, but perceptual. The patterns of thought that generated and sustained our current civilization, linearity, extreme specialization, separation from nature, externalization of costs, are precisely the patterns that become fatally unstable in the final part of the cycle. Ancient contemplative traditions have always maintained that true transformation requires a metanoia, a fundamental change in how we perceive reality. The non-ordinary states of consciousness studied by both mystical traditions and modern neuroscience offer glimpses of alternative modes of perception that may be crucial for navigating the transition that awaits us. The true meaning of the 1229-year cycle may not be a deterministic fate, but an invitation to conscious evolution. Each cycle represents an opportunity for collective human consciousness to transcend previous limitations and emerge at a new level of complexity and integration. The Maya did not see the end of their calendar cycles as apocalypse, but as necessary transformation, death followed by rebirth in a more evolved form. Fractal mathematics teaches us that patterns can repeat without being identical. Each iteration occurs at a different level of the evolutionary spiral. Perhaps we are approaching not the end of human civilization, but the end of a particular mode of civilization, opening space for something fundamentally new to emerge from the seeds of consciousness that we plant now. The true revelation of this investigation is not the imminent collapse predicted by the Thuban constant, but the possibility of conscious transformation that it offers us. The ancients understood that the end of a cycle does not mean the end of everything, but an opportunity for rebirth at a higher level of consciousness and organization. As we navigate the turbulent years ahead, we carry not only the weight of knowledge of this cosmic pattern, but also the responsibility to use it to cultivate the seeds of a new era. If you are interested in exploring more about spirituality, I have specially selected for you some videos filled with profound knowledge and fascinating discoveries that you will love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step to transform your reality.